There is strong evidence that in the past, humans experienced a completely different mentality to modern humans, almost as though they were an entirely different species. Their volition wasn't directed by their ego or their felt sense of self, but rather they heard voices. Loud, audible voices which seemed to be coming from a supernatural entity. And this voice would tell them what to do, especially in novel situations where they couldn't simply rely on their instincts. This explains the origins of religion, and it explains why humans in the past were so reverential of these beings called gods, because they depended upon these gods for their volition, and they were tangibly experienced through hallucinations. But it's clear that over time, this mentality was replaced by ego consciousness, which is why you watching this video probably don't experience auditory hallucinations, although you do probably experience your own internal monologue. Unless, of course, you are one of those individuals who still experiences hallucinations today. A fair number of people do experience such voices just as they're falling asleep. For others, these voices appear to be occasioned by episodes of extreme stress. And others hear these voices more regularly because they have schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is considered a dysfunctional mental disorder, and so people with schizophrenia are considered sick and in need of treatment. But I would argue that there's nothing inherently wrong with them. Rather, their minds are incompatible with the way we have structured our modern societies. A structure which is deeply flawed in my opinion and leading to significant unhappiness, but that's a discussion for another time. So in some sense, the bicameral mind still exists in people with schizophrenia. But it isn't exactly the same, because there are no existing bicameral civilizations where the social structure itself depends upon experiencing these auditory hallucinations. Furthermore, we tend to tell people with schizophrenia that these voices aren't real and that they shouldn't be listened to. The voices are considered pathological and dysfunctional rather than useful and adaptive as they were in the bicameral mind. And so we often treat the bicameral mind as an extinct mentality which used to exist but no longer does. And in fact, many people use this fact to discredit the theory altogether, because if it did exist in the past, you would expect there to be at least some examples of the bicameral mind that exist today, especially amongst primitive societies. But what if such societies do exist today? You see, I've recently taken an interest in phenomena which appear to be extinct or, archaic and therefore a relic of the past, but actually still exist in some form. For example, we tend to think of dinosaurs as being extinct, but dinosaurs aren't extinct at all. In fact, birds are living dinosaurs. Just look at this intimidating thing. And so similarly, the bicameral mind might still exist in certain pockets around the world. And I believe that the phenomenon of shamanism, which still exists in many parts of the world today, can, in many instances, be regarded as a modern form of the bicameral mind. Shamanism is a form of religion where a specific individual, known as the shaman, is responsible for making contact with another spiritual world. This contact is done for the purpose of communicating with the beings that live in this spirit world and relaying any information that they may possess. They may also help guide other individuals through their journeys through the spirit world. This is a very widespread phenomenon across the world, and while it is disappearing and being replaced by other forms of religion or even forms of irreligion, there is a good case to be made that shamanism is the same bicameral phenomenon which used to exist in the past. To examine this claim, I'm going to look at a paper from the Journal of Culture, Medicine, and Psychiatry, which is actually open access, so you can read it yourself. I'll put a link down in the description. If my professor, Dr. Risco, is watching, see, I do cite my sources. Also in the description is my email if you're interested in doing therapy with me. More on that later. Now, this paper specifically examines shamanism as it exists in the African country of Ghana, where the shamans are referred to as okomfo. Okomfo are people who start to experience auditory hallucinations at around the age of 20. And instead of being diagnosed with schizophrenia, they are trained in the art of becoming a shaman, which involves learning more about the gods whose voices they're hearing and learning to distinguish the different gods that they may hear, as well as between, the voices of gods and the voices of other supernatural entities such as spirits or demons. The authors write the following. The okomfo are priests. They are understood to have special relationships with a range of greater and lesser spirits, which are in some sense housed within a shrine which they tend. Typically, the okomfo develops a relationship with one god, who calls or chooses him or her. The okomfo who accepts the call is then trained by apprenticeship with more senior okomfo in the ritual procedures for interacting with the god. Over time, the okomfo may acquire relationships with other gods and spirits. At intervals, the priest feeds each god according to his or her wants. Other people will come as clients to the shrine, asking for protection from dangerous supernatural forces or healing and other needs. If you're familiar with the bicameral mind as it manifested in ancient Egypt, a lot of this should be familiar to you. Each priest speaks to a handful of gods, with one god being the primary one whom they communicate with. And over time, they develop a special relationship with this god, effectively becoming the emissary for it. Amazingly, the authors also refer to an opening of the mouth ceremony which needs to be performed in order to get the gods to speak, which is exactly what's described in ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. The gods are housed in a shrine, and apparently they need to be given food. And the shamans are also responsible for interceding with the gods on other people's behalf. Now, this intercession process, as described in the paper, is particularly fascinating. When consulted by a client, the god will enter the okomfo, who then becomes a living presence of the god for the human who has come to consult. Sometimes the possessed okomfo speaks in ways that the client will understand. Sometimes, however, the possessed okomfo speech will need to be interpreted for the client by a second person associated with the shrine, the obrafo. After the god has gone, the okomfo will often, but not always, be amnestic for all that has happened during the possession. The god can, however, talk with the okomfo outside of possession, through dreams, visions, and words heard out loud or in the mind. Many okomfo talk easily about what a god has told them to do, and about their conversations and relationships with their gods. According to the models of the psyche which we discuss on this channel, we understand the different voices which a person with schizophrenia hears as being different parts of their unconscious psyche. These shamans appear to let these unconscious personalities, i.e. their different gods, possess their bodies momentarily, allowing other people to temporarily communicate with the god. Often the shaman themselves doesn't seem to remember that they were possessed by a god, which indicates that their ego was completely dissolved during these states. And it indicates that it really is a state of total possession from one of these unconscious complexes. And so there's this transient state where a person's ego isn't responsible for their actions. Rather, it is a god who is directing their speech and moving their bodies. So here we have a modern example of people who regularly interact with gods by listening to their auditory hallucinations. And so much of it resembles how ancient cultures also interacted with their gods, strengthening the idea that the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Mesopotamians, amongst others, also interacted with their gods through auditory hallucinations. So it does seem that the bicameral mind very much still exists today. It is not extinct. However, there are some caveats which distinguish this phenomenon from the bicameral mind as described in the book. Because it seems like these shamans do possess an ego. And so it's not as if every action they perform is directed by the will of their god. Certainly, some of what they do is because a god told them to do so, but not necessarily in a moment-to-moment volitional way. So this could represent a weak form of bicamerality. Possibly because these shamans are still raised in a culture that's ego-dominated. And it's only when they start to hear auditory hallucinations that they become shamans, rather than, hearing these hallucinations throughout their entire lives. However, the fact that the gods can temporarily possess the shaman does indicate a state where their volition is entirely directed by a god rather than their egos. So it seems to suggest that maybe this is what the bicameral mind was like in earlier civilizations, before the ego slowly developed out of that original situation. It was a state of being possessed by a god. But again, this seems to be distinct from being able to hear the gods, as the paper notes. It distinguishes from being possessed by a god such that it speaks through you, and hearing the voices of the gods in auditory hallucinations. The way the bicameral mind was originally conceived was you hear a voice, it tells you what to do, and then you would do it, rather than a god fully possessing your body. Although again, it could be a state of a god possessing your body because you heard this voice. All this is to say is that maybe things are way more complicated than we've even imagined. But regardless, I find it really fascinating that a person can voluntarily give up their ego to be possessed by another part of their personality. There's definitely a lot there to unravel and think about. So overall, I think this shows some of the strongest evidence for the theory of the bicameral mind, because it shows an example of people who are actively experiencing hallucinations which they interpret as coming from a divine source. It may not be exactly the same way that the bicameral mentality is described, but this could be because of the fact that the ego mentality is so prevailing and so dominant that it resulted in a weak form of bicamerality. But regardless, it's still amazing that a completely different mentality still exists today in our world amongst humans. And again, there are other forms of shamanism across the world, and this paper focused on one example in particular, but more examination could reveal, a similar bicameral mentality across other shamanistic groups. Now, before I let you all go, I wanted to let you know that I'm currently accepting new clients for therapy. I recently became a registered psychotherapist qualifying. The qualifying basically means that they're waiting to make sure that I don't cause irreparable mental harm to anybody. But so far, I've been working with a wide range of clients, and I think all of them have had a positive experience with me. So if you're interested as well, feel free to shoot me an email and I can explain the process to you. Anyways, that's all I have to say. Have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.